So thank you very much, Ewood. We'll now move straight on to the next paper, which is from Mette Svart Kristiansen. Mette is an associate professor at Aarhus University in Denmark. Her main research area is medieval rural settlements. She is the national representative for Ruralia, the organisation for the study of rural settlement in Europe, and head of the network Medieval Rural Denmark. Before she started working at Aarhus, she was head of excavations at the Øresund coast-to-coast link and on the subway in Copenhagen. So Mette will be talking about infrastructure archaeology and medieval rural settlements in Denmark. Mette, it's all yours. Thank you very much.
So in this overview and discussion of infrastructure projects and medieval settlements, I will begin with a few words on the organization of archaeology in Denmark to understand the context for how infrastructure archaeology is done here. Then we will have a closer look at some of the projects, focusing on the gas pipe and the motorway construction and the archaeology done there, and discuss the development of methods and strategies. In comparison with prehistoric settlements, the development have resulted in relatively few medieval rural sites, and I will comment on why this might be the case. I will also comment on why the infrastructure projects are important for understanding the settlement structure. In Denmark, all archaeology is museum-based. We do not have private companies. All excavations are conducted by the local museums. During the later years, there has been major mergers within the museum landscape, and today Danish archaeology is organized in 27 areas of responsibility. The developers pay for the excavations and reports, but are not obliged to pay for further research. This will have to be financed by the museums or external funding for larger projects. Sites and historic monuments are registered in this national database, Fund og Fortidsminder, partly open to the public. The museums are responsible for updates, and the purpose is to serve as administrative tool for municipalities, museums, entrepreneurs, and other parties involved in planning, and ideally to serve as tools for research. The more than 160,000 sites on land and seafloor, dating from prehistory to modern times, almost paint a land map of Denmark. Most of the data I will refer to during my presentation are retrieved from here. It's a complicated database. Some very intensive decades of developer-led excavations have put an enormous pressure on the museums, and the data are unfortunately not up to date always. Some museums are lagging behind on retrospective reporting on sites. Sometimes the date and features reported are related to the preliminary examination of the site and not the final and updated ones after excavation, which has serious impact on search results. The data to pull out is only as good as the data you put in. Rescue excavations prior to large-scale construction work have resulted in the recovery of a large number of sites since the first Protective Museum Act in 1969. The laying of motorways across Denmark from the mid-50s, the natural gas pipelines in the 80s, and other large infrastructure projects have offered thousands of kilometers stitches across Denmark. Many of the infrastructure projects have produced anthologies supported by the developers, and you will also find papers and monographs related to single sites. It will be fair, though, to say that data are a bit piling up in archives and storerooms, and there is little time and few money for post-excavation research. What we miss in Denmark, and I do welcome this discussion initiated by the Medieval Settlement Research Group, is to reflect on the advancement of knowledge and understanding offered by archaeological investigations of medieval rural settlement resulting from these developments. Much discussion in Denmark is related to methodology and workflow at the site. How do we identify the sites? What type of sites do we miss and why? And how do we optimize the archaeological process and the collaboration with the developer? Let's have a closer look at the first large infrastructure project in Denmark, the natural gas project in the 80s, which resulted in approximately 1,700 archaeological investigations stretching for some 3,000 kilometers in a 10-meter broad belt across Denmark from east to west and north to south. Approximately 1,200 are recovered in the database, an example of the before-mentioned backlog issue. A national strategy for management and a short project period produced comparable results across Denmark, and the project added considerably to the archaeological knowledge, particularly on prehistoric settlement structure and regionality. Only about 35 investigations were related to medieval rural settlement. The low numbers were in the project conclusion explained as, I quote, a consequence of the fact that the basic settlement pattern remained the same from the end of the Viking Age to the beginning of the Middle Age, quote, ended. I will come back to this explanation. First, some words to this diagram. It is based on the 20 investigations used for the conclusions. I have listed it so it's possible to go behind the arguments and conclusions. First, we have the background for pilot investigation. Is it reconnaissance, indications on historical maps, and so on? Then results from pilot investigations and from the following excavation as far it was carried out. We can see several of the pilot investigations ended with negative results, even though surface reconnaissance indicated for settlement. I was curious about the remaining 15 sites. So I added the missing investigations to the ones used for the conclusions, here highlighted in bold, to try to understand the contemporary discussions in the project of what were identified as important features and structures. Though the numbers we are talking about are few, we might be able to identify some common traits. The added sites have features like pits, post holes, and furrows from rigid fields, but no or only one building, and in a single case, perhaps two buildings. The importance of a site seems to relate to the presence and number of buildings. We have to see this focus on buildings in a research context, where archaeologists since the 60s conducted a series of large settlement excavations, in particular in Jutland, and in particular with focus on settlement structure and definition of house types from the early pre-Roman Iron Age to the Viking Age, perhaps early medieval period, that's the mid-11th century. The medieval rural settlement was not on the table as a research object per se, neither for the predominantly prehistoric archaeologists working in the open landscape, nor the medieval archaeologists who, since the 70s, where medieval archaeology got its own university chair, were occupied by booming urban excavations, as well as excavations of moats, castles, churches, and monasteries. Excavations on rural medieval settlement until the mid-80s, where Denmark got a new Museum Act, are few. We also have to see this focus in a context where a powerful model for the settlement structure, exactly in the early years of the gas project, was widely acknowledged in the archaeological understanding of how the Viking Age settlement was moving from place to place in a resource area and settled as a historic medieval village. The single farms and the thorps were in the 80s more flimsy structures, at least in the archaeological perception of rural life and in the recordings in the field. Today, 40 years of archaeology later, we should see the pits, the one building and the well excluded from the gas project conclusion as a result of the many different types of medieval settlement structures. But I must say, though, that it is still the buildings which are in focus today. Another item to comment on is the preservation issues. Common to the medieval sites are their position in ploughed fields, and we still need to get a better understanding of why some sites are gone, others not. There are several factors. The introduction of building on sills in the 12th century, of course, adds to the poor preservation. The site at Skovby, where pilot excavations only recorded a well, could be such a site. The thickness of the topsoil may also have entailed this, dug-in features like pits, fences and ditches to heat subsoil. Actually, very few ditches are reported, though there can be very dominant features. Perhaps they are recorded but not understood. It was only in the late 80s and early 90s that ditches were identified as a part of the structure. The terrain is also a factor. Features from farms on the top of hills are more likely to be ploughed down, whereas features lying low might be better protected by added topsoil from higher areas. Among the excluded sites, we also have furrow from rigid fields. Surprisingly, out of 1,700 investigations, they are only recorded on 4 sites on the gas pipe. The number is surprisingly low. They clearly do not fit into the predominant search perspective on interesting buildings and are perceived as, and I quote, troublesome rigid fields, quote, who damage the interesting features. End start of quote. The structures were heavily damaged by a number of furrows from rigid fields, quote ended, and another quote. The southern half of the house was to some extent damaged by a furrow between 2 ridges, a phenomenon which moreover complicated the interpretation of major part of the site, quote ended. The natural gas project is usually assessed as predominantly valuable for prehistoric periods, and within the project there seemed to be some disappointment on the results for the medieval settlement, though anticipated. However, the biased chronological distribution of settlements was not just affecting the Middle Ages, but also other periods. And this strongly indicated the need for new reconnaissance and excavation methods. This was developed during the next decades. The gas project also reintroduced the medieval rural settlement in the settlement archaeology after a few decades on the sideline. Important was the excavation at Bullergård, probably a mid-12th century predecessor to the historic village Værst nearby. A new gas pipe through the old excavation area made it possible to revisit the site in 2011. New knowledge of house types gained in the intermediate period made it possible to reinterpret the data. For example, 2 small constructions for haystacks and a building was reinterpreted as a smaller, the green, and a larger house, the blue, with lean-tos, a house type now very common in this part of Denmark. Actually, the Baltic Pipeline, our latest infrastructure project, added further to the site last year. The site's Toftagervej, excavated by Roskilde Museum, which only presented some pits and post-holes in the gas project, did a few years later, due to another construction work, reveal the nice farm on top of a hill just north to the gas line. Here we see ditches defining functional spaces around 3 buildings and interaction between the Toft and the surrounding resource areas. Have a closer look at the motorways, which particularly in the 90s and onwards have caused much archaeological activity. The motorways give up to 200-meter wide tracks through the landscape with work areas, baffle walls, stormwater reservoirs and areas for slip roads. Here we have such a site with a medieval farm excavated by Roskilde Museum. This is one of several excavations in the 7-hectare large area around the slip roads for the new motorway, where also settlement from Iron Age and Viking Age was excavated. We see post holes from 2 buildings and 2 types of ditches, some related to the farm and its tofts. Other more curved ditches coincide the borders between 2 cadastral districts registered on a plot map from the early 19th century. The sites registered in relation to the motorway system in Denmark almost paint a roadmap. The very low number of medieval sites is not representative, but due to the fact that a site needs a main date in the Site and Monuments database. So we will find medieval settlement registered under other periods, where the physical evidence is more substantial and powerful. For example, the very visible Iron Age settlements, or under periods first registered on the site. If we dig a bit deeper in the database, we find more sites with medieval features. This deeper level is unfortunately also the one where the museums can have difficulties to find time to register the full chronological span and varieties of structures on the site. You'll have to look that up in the individual excavation reports. This, of course, evaluate the use of the system for analytical approaches and research. All this might appear a trivial data management problem, but I think this have implications on the way we look at the medieval rural settlement. There is a risk that a single medieval farm will drop down in the registration structure, and that this will spill over on the attention and the priorities made. That the medieval settlement appears a bycatch, not just by appearance in the trenches, but conceptually as well. Let us look at the data we actually have and what they don't tell us. In general, and not in particular related to infrastructure projects, we do have a problem with dating of medieval settlement. It would be valuable for further discussions of the data if we could make dating more transparent, just like we identify dendrochronological dates. Medieval sites in general leave only few objects for dating, and though systematic C14 dating has become a strategy at many museums, many buildings are still dated by based on typology. It is not to say if the pattern we see in the diagram reflects changes in settlement structure or the bad preservation conditions for late medieval buildings on sill in plowed fields, or habitual thinking and dating to early and high medieval period by archaeologists, because this will support the conventional ideas of the development in the settlement structure. Then a few words on methods and strategies. The experience from the fieldwork in the 80s and 90s gave rise to much discussion of how to secure an area prior to development and to engage more efficiently with the developers, often the state, also across the areas of responsibilities divided between museums. In order to catch some of the missing periods, museums argued for systematic trial trenching instead of reconnaissance and topographical criteria. The impact of shower breadth, orientation of trenches and spaces between them has been scrutinized and calculated to gain the most efficient catch. Much was in the beginning discussed in relation to the apparently ever-present Iron Age. Medieval settlements were rarely considered in these early but formative years of strategic discussions. Over the years, strategies has been adapted to fit regional differences in topography and density in settlement and structures. In many museums, you will also find a concern in identifying all periods, also the medieval and early modern ones. Interpreted or integrated are also aerial photos, LiDAR, and historical maps. Today, you will find coverage in the preliminary investigations from 12 to 20% of the affected area and a distance between trenches from 15 to 20 meters. How does this fit with the medieval settlement? This medieval farm at Holdam, with a well dendrochronological dated date to 1206, was excavated by Museum Sønderjylland as a part of a motorway project. Trial excavations on the motorway was done with 20-meter distance between north-south oriented trenches and identified many sites from different periods due to adoption of a variety of strategies. Holdam is a compact and fairly large farm and easy identified by a trial trenching. But what would you miss? The diagram in the top is based on a little more than 400 buildings from approximately 70 sites. Many of the small buildings, mostly haysheds or minor economy buildings, would slip through the trenches, but also the smaller east-west orientated houses. Houses in most prehistory were orientated east-west, but during late Iron Age and later, we see a growing number of north-south oriented buildings, and they could also be missed in north-south oriented trenching strategies. It would be interesting to evaluate the kind of medieval structures you would find on large excavations and see how different strategies for trial trenching would have identified the medieval farms of different kind and different sizes. Some medieval sites are, of course, very substantial, but what about the small farms? And what about the large farms with buildings dispersed over a large tuft with empty areas? How many of them would we see by trial trenching down the motorway course? And can we use the same strategies for larger areas as for motorways? Larger infrastructure projects can give us important new knowledge on the medieval settlement structure because they might transect landscapes and regions where development otherwise is not so intense. Let's look at an example. On the map, we see a part of Jutland, and the area of responsibility for Museum Midtjylland is enhanced. The dots are medieval or early modern settlement sites. The red ones are sites excavated prior to the new motorway between the medieval towns Vejle at the east coast of Jutland and Holstebro in the northwest. The motorway crosses large areas of old heathlands where settlement structure in the early modern period are characterized by single farms. Today, most activity and development is around the rapidly growing city Herning, founded in the mid-19th century as trade center in the mid of the heath. And as you can see, the dots are relatively few and scattered in the rest of the area. If we go back in time, this topographical map from the mid-19th century gives an idea of the very different landscapes along the east coast and the mid and western parts of Jutland. Going further back in the 18th century to the Royal Academy's first maps measured by modern standards, the resources comes forward. Let us zoom in and place Herning on the map. We can see how the archaeologists have identified sites on the motorway placed on the boundaries between the so-called open area for agriculture, meadows and heathland, and a strategic exploitation of different resources. In the early modern period, farms in this area were organized in flexible communities, had animal husbandry along fertile river valleys and agriculture on the sandy soil. The area differs profoundly from settlement structures in the eastern part of Jutland, where clay soil provide background for villages and an agriculture based on grain.
2 minutes.
Big infrastructure projects usually avoid villages. In rare occasions, they have to intersect, as was the case with the coast-to-coast line between Denmark and Sweden, where motorway and railway crossed the village Tornby south of Copenhagen. Unlike most other sites on the motorway, the village here protected the cultural layers. As you could see, they were quite substantial. Other areas could have fine preservation conditions too. For example, forests, where deserted villages or single farms later are overgrown, or some coastal areas where sand drift has covered large areas, settlements and fields as well. We will not have a motorway here, but it could be the case for smaller types of infrastructure projects, for example, rollout of electric cables. The route may not be more than 8 to 10 meters wide, and in many occasions only produce a dot on the map and indicate a point of interest in case of further development in the area. But if the cable intersects an area covered with sand drift, there might be very well preserved structures. And to some final words. Much attention within rural settlement archaeology is related to the historical villages, the cores, and the development in their outskirts. And large developments are situated in densely populated areas with a high economic growth. The infrastructure projects, whatever size, intersect the landscapes in new ways and brings the attention to areas usually not in focus. That is, the areas conceptually far away from the settlements, the belonging field systems and borders in the landscapes. But it also, and importantly, allows archaeology to investigate areas where development is scarce. In the last decades, the distribution maps are developing dramatically, and the infrastructure projects add to this. Thank you for your attention.